In the summer of 1977, on the quiet northern shore of Oahu, a young mother left home with her 6-month-old son, promising to return before noon. The road she took was familiar, the sea calm, the town unchanged. But somewhere between the house and the horizon, both she and the child vanished without a trace. No struggle, no witnesses, only an empty stroller left beneath the palms. What began as an ordinary morning would become one of Hawaii's strangest unsolved mysteries. Hau'ula, on the northern shore of Oahu, was the kind of town that never hurried. Wooden houses sat low beneath coconut palms. The single road curved along the beach, and the rhythm of life followed the tides rather than the clock. Fishermen returned at dawn. School children walked in clusters under the same sun their grandparents once did. And by noon, the island heat folded everything into silence. Locals liked to say the sea always gave back what it took. A net, a sandal, a missing trinket. Sooner or later, the tide would return it. The Barnes family had lived in that silence for nearly 2 years. Mark Barnes, 32, worked repairing electrical lines for homes scattered along the coast. He was the kind of man who spoke little, rose with the first light, and measured each day by the tasks his hands completed. His wife, Charlotte Moriarty, 31, was his opposite, soft, spontaneous, and sometimes distant, a woman with the manner of someone who never fully arrived anywhere. After giving birth to their first child, Mark's Panama Barnes, she grew quieter still. Neighbors noticed her drifting between calm and unease, taking long walks alone or staring at the water as if expecting an answer from it. Marks was 6 months old that summer, a round-faced boy who laughed when the waves hit the shore. Mark had built his crib from leftover wood and painted it sky blue. Charlotte lined it with seashells she found on her walks. To anyone passing by, they were a modest but happy family. A young couple starting out, a baby whose world was no larger than the sound of the ocean behind their house. On the morning of June 21st, 1977, Charlotte dressed Marks in a light cotton shirt, tucked a blanket around him, and said quietly, "We'll go for a short walk." It was just past 9. The sun was soft. The air smelled of wet leaves. Mark was crouched by the kitchen outlet, tightening a screw. Without looking up, he answered, "Be back before lunch." She smiled, the kind of smile that didn't need a reply, and rolled the stroller out through the doorway. The wooden floor creaked, then stilled. The walk to the small grocery store down the road took less than 10 minutes if you walked straight, though Charlotte rarely did. She liked to stop where the sand met the road, watching the waves break against the rocks. That morning, no one saw where she went after leaving the house. Around noon, the neighbor who lived near the coconut grove noticed something that made him pause. Stroller standing alone by the roadside, its small blanket folded neatly inside. He assumed the mother was close by, perhaps sitting somewhere with the baby. By the time he passed again, an hour later, the stroller was still there. Mark came home from work just after 12. The house was quiet. He called out her name once, twice. No answer. The baby's bottle sat on the counter, untouched. He stepped outside, expecting at any moment to see Charlotte appear from the corner, pushing the stroller as she always did. Only the shimmer of heat rose from the road. He waited another half hour, then started walking the route himself. At the grocery store, the clerk shook his head. "Didn't see her today," he said. Mark thanked him and kept walking, asking whoever he met the same question. "Have you seen a woman with brown hair carrying a baby?" Most people hadn't. A few thought they might have, someone by the beach, maybe, or near the bus stop. But no one was sure. Near the grove, he saw the stroller. It looked untouched, perfectly still, as if it had been placed there on purpose, The blanket was folded. The sun had bleached its corner a faint white. No footprints around it, no tire tracks, no struggle. Just the faint hum of the wind moving through the trees. He stood there for a long time, one hand resting on the handle. The emptiness of the stroller said more than words could. Mark wheeled it home in silence. The small front yard, once bright with the sound of the baby's laughter, felt hollow. He searched the nearby houses until dusk, walking up and down the same stretch of road until the sky dimmed. When darkness came, he turned on the porch light and left the door unlocked. That night, he did not sleep. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at the stroller by the window. In a town where nothing ever truly disappeared, the absence of his wife and child felt unnatural, as if the sea had swallowed something it wasn't supposed to. He told himself they would return by morning, that there must be some simple reason, a misunderstanding, a visit, a delay. But when the first light came over the horizon, the house was still quiet. Outside, the ocean breathed its same rhythm, indifferent and steady. In Hau'ula, the locals often said the sea always gave back what it took. Yet that night, and many after, it did not. From that morning onward, no one saw Charlotte Moriarty or Mark's Panama barns again. By the third morning, exhaustion had carved itself into Mark's face. He had spent 2 nights walking between the house and the coast, sleeping only when his body refused to continue. At sunrise, he finally decided to go to the Honolulu Police Department and file a formal report. He arrived carrying a photograph of Charlotte holding Mark's on the porch, the baby in her arms, the sea behind them, both smiling. He placed it on the officer's desk and said quietly, "They're gone. 3 days now." The officer on duty, a middle-aged man, with a calm voice, filled out the initial paperwork. He asked the questions as if reading from a list: last seen where, what she was wearing, whether she'd ever left before. When Mark admitted that Charlotte had occasionally disappeared for a few days in the past, the man's expression shifted slightly, the kind of look that turned a family crisis into a routine entry in a file. "Sometimes new mothers need space," he said gently, writing the words, "possible voluntary absence" in the corner of the form. That single assumption slowed everything. The report was logged but not marked urgent. It would take another 2 days before the first officer was officially assigned to the case. When the search did begin, it followed the same pattern every investigation on the island did. First the beach, then the forest, then the places where the lost might seek shelter. Officers and volunteers walked along the stretch of Hau'ula coast, their boots sinking into the sand, scanning for anything that might belong to a mother and her child. A shoe, a diaper bag, a piece of clothing. They found nothing. The small forest behind the highway was searched next. Locals joined, carrying flashlights even in daylight, calling Charlotte's name into the trees. The sound echoed back empty. At one point, a volunteer thought he heard a baby crying deep inside the brush, but when they followed the sound, it turned out to be a bird hidden in the canopy, its calls sharp and deceiving. Police extended the search to Kahuku Hospital, checking if a woman matching Charlotte's description had been admitted. The nurses looked through their logs, no one by that name, no one with a 6-month-old infant. They checked homeless shelters, mission houses, even small churches that sometimes offered space for troubled families. Again, nothing. By the end of the first week, the case drew the attention of a local reporter from the Honolulu Star Bulletin. The short article appeared in the community section. "Mother and infant missing from Hau'ula. Police request information." It included the photo Mark had given, slightly grainy in print, but clear enough to recognize the gentle slope of Charlotte's face and the bright round eyes of baby Mark's. Beneath it was a phone number for tips. Calls began to come in, most of them vague. One woman claimed she had seen someone who resembled Charlotte sitting near a bus stop on the highway, holding a baby and staring into the distance. She looked lost, the caller said. Not crying, not asking for help, just somewhere else in her mind. Officers followed up that lead the next day, checking every bus line heading north. No ticket, no witness who could confirm it. The trail dissolved before it began. Mark joined every stage of the search. He drove his old pickup from town to town, stopping at diners, service stations, and small markets, showing the same photo over and over. Some recognized her face, most didn't. One man said he thought he'd seen her buying baby formula in Wahiawa, but when Mark arrived there hours later, the clerk couldn't recall anything. Each evening, he returned home with a new plan for the next day. Places to check, people to call, flyers to print. His kitchen table turned into a map of the island drawn from memory, pins marking every rumor. Nights were the hardest. He kept the radio on to fill the silence, waiting for the phone to ring. Sometimes it did, but the voice on the other end only offered false hope. Another mistaken sighting, another dead end. The detectives assigned to the case, 2 men from the missing persons unit, were professional, but cautious. They told Mark that without evidence of a struggle or signs of danger, they could not treat it as a criminal matter. Their reports described Charlotte as a mother under emotional strain. It was language that softened the tragedy into a category, one among many. After 2 weeks, a small search party combed the shoreline again, this time using dogs trained to detect scent. They started from the spot where the stroller had been found and moved outward in widening circles. The dogs picked up a faint trail leading toward the main road, but it ended abruptly at the asphalt, where the wind carried away any remaining trace. As the days passed, the community's attention began to fade. Other stories filled the newspapers: a fishing accident, a small fire, the usual rhythm of island life. Mark stayed behind that rhythm, caught in a loop of repetition. Drive, ask, wait. Each face he passed on the street became a potential witness. Each mother carrying a baby made his heart seize. At the police station, the bulletin board held the same notice week after week. A single line was added beneath the photo. Still missing. Officers updated him politely, but had little new to say. On the 18th day, one of the detectives approached Mark outside the station. He spoke carefully, as if choosing words that would cause the least harm. "We'll keep the file open," he said, "but unless we get a solid lead, there's not much more we can do." Mark nodded, though he barely heard him. He had already decided he would not stop looking, no matter what the paperwork said. That night, back in Hau'ula, the sea was unusually calm. The porch light burned as it had every night since Charlotte left. Mark sat beside it until long after midnight, his hands clasped, the empty stroller beside him. The town slept. The waves whispered their same endless rhythm. Somewhere beyond that darkness, he told himself, she was still walking, still holding their child, still trying to find her way home. But when the sun rose again, there was only the road, the palms, and the steady hum of the ocean. Charlotte Moriarty and her baby, Mark's Panama Barnes, had vanished without leaving a single trace. By the end of that summer, the air in Hau'ula had turned heavier, the afternoon rains falling almost daily. For most residents, life moved on. But for Mark Barnes, the days blurred into each other, one long repetition of the same search that refused to end. He stopped keeping count after the 30th day. The police still had his number pinned to the corner of their bulletin board, though the phone hardly rang anymore. The investigation that had begun with urgency slowly slipped into silence. The initial reports were stored in a thin brown folder labeled 1977 HNL 302, missing adult and infant. It carried the same handwritten note from the first week. No signs of foul play. Possible voluntary departure. That phrase would stay attached to Charlotte's name for decades. In late July, an officer from Honolulu called to update Mark. The message was brief. No new witnesses, no confirmed sightings. They had checked with clinics, state shelters, and transportation offices. No one matching Charlotte's description had been recorded. One nurse mentioned treating a woman who seemed confused, but when shown a photograph, she hesitated, saying only that the patient had left before anyone learned her name. It was a dead end, like every lead before. At home, Mark tried to maintain routine. He returned to work after a few weeks, though colleagues noticed the way he would pause in the middle of tasks, staring at nothing. The toolbox stayed in the back of his truck, the passenger seat empty except for a stack of missing posters he still carried, folded and worn at the edges. On weekends, he drove across the island to towns where the local papers didn't circulate as far, leaving flyers on notice boards. Missing since June 21st. Mother, age 31, brown hair, traveling with infant son. Sometimes people took them down, thinking the matter was old. Each time he printed more. In early August, the police department made one final sweep of the area. A helicopter traced the shoreline. Officers revisited the grove where the stroller had been found. The sand had long shifted. A few volunteers joined, but it felt more symbolic than hopeful. By then, everyone understood how small the island could feel, and how vast it could become when someone truly disappeared. Weeks passed. Mark began writing letters, to hospitals, to state agencies on the mainland, even to child welfare offices in other islands. He included photographs and a brief note explaining that a woman and child might have arrived under new names. Most letters were never answered. A few returned unopened, stamped "No record found." In October, the file was officially moved from active search to pending review. The detectives had done what procedure required. They had interviewed witnesses, searched the perimeter, notified the Coast Guard. Without evidence of a crime, they could only mark the case as unresolved. That winter, Mark left his job with the repair company. He rented a small apartment in Honolulu to stay closer to the police archives, spending afternoons reading through old missing person reports. He learned that in Hawaii, names could vanish easily. A misfiled document, a wrong date of birth, a single unchecked box could turn a person into a ghost within the system. He feared that was what had happened to Charlotte and Mark's. There were moments of fragile hope. In 1978, a social worker from the mainland contacted him about a woman fitting Charlotte's description who had been seen in San Francisco with a small child. Mark flew there on borrowed money, only to find it was someone else. He came back with nothing but a heavier heart and a deeper understanding of how many faces could resemble hers when one was desperate enough to believe. Through the 1980s, the search became a part of his identity. Friends drifted away. Family visits grew less frequent. He learned to speak in simple sentences, avoiding the subject unless asked directly. When he did, he always said the same thing. "They're out there somewhere. I just haven't found the right question yet." In 1992, an officer named Lieutenant Halikoa from the Honolulu Missing Persons Unit reopened several dormant cases for administrative review. Among them was file 1977 HNL 302. He met with Mark briefly and offered to reissue the missing notices with updated digital images. For the first time, Charlotte's face was recreated through computer-age progression software, showing what she might look like after 15 years. The image was grainy but human. Older, more tired, yet unmistakably her. The poster was distributed again, printed in black and white, stapled to bulletin boards in grocery stores and post offices. Months later, no new information surfaced. The file returned to the cabinet, this time under cold case. By the late 1990s, Mark had grown older, his hair thinning, his search slower. He kept the same house in Hauula, but rarely used it, visiting only on anniversaries. The porch light still worked. He replaced the bulb every year, a quiet ritual no one asked about. Then, in 2001, a name appeared in the old records, Jennifer Barnes, a young woman from California who claimed to be Charlotte's daughter from a previous relationship. She had discovered the story of the disappearance and requested that the Honolulu police reopen the file. Jennifer asked for one thing: to create an age-progressed image of the missing infant, her half-brother, Mark's Panama Barnes. The request was granted. A forensic artist studied baby photographs, family traits, and genetic probabilities, producing an image of what Mark's might look like as an adult in his 20s. It was archived, cataloged, and uploaded years later to the National Missing Children database. Mark never saw that image. By then he was living quietly, battling illness and years of disappointment. When officers visited him to confirm the details for the updated record, he simply nodded. "Put whatever helps," he said. "I just want to know before I die whether they made it somewhere safe." After that, the case faded again. 34 years had passed since Charlotte's walk down that sunlit road, and in the memory of most officers, the name Barnes meant nothing more than another unresolved file in the archives. Yet in that same file lay the photograph of the child's digitally aged face, waiting, silent, unremarkable, until one morning, decades later, when a man half a world away would open a web page, recognize his own reflection staring back at him, and make the call that would change everything. It was a quiet Monday morning in early 2011 when the duty officer at the Honolulu Police Department's Missing Persons Unit answered a call from an unfamiliar area code. The line crackled faintly, the kind of static that came from thousands of miles of ocean between the voices. "Honolulu Police Department Missing Persons," the officer said. A pause. Then a man's voice, calm but uncertain. "I hope I'm calling the right place. I think I might be someone you've been looking for." The officer frowned, typing the caller ID into the system. It showed New Jersey. He asked for a name. "My name's Steve Carter," the voice said. "I was adopted from Hawaii back in the late 70s. I found something online. A picture. It looks like me, but it's not. The name under it is Mark's Panama Moriarty Barnes." The officer felt the familiar reflex of skepticism that came from too many false leads. Still, the detail was specific, too specific to ignore. "Where did you see the photo?" "On missingkids.com, Carter replied. "It's an age-progressed picture of a boy missing since 1977, 6 months old at the time, from Oahu. The birthday listed is one day different from mine. Everything else looks the same." There was a long silence on the line. The officer pulled the old case log from the database. File 1977 HNL 302, missing adult and infant, Charlotte Moriarty and son Mark's Panama Barnes. The record had not been opened in years. He glanced at the notes. Mother possibly unstable, last seen June 21, 1977. Infant presumed deceased or untraceable. He looked back at the phone receiver, lowering his voice. "Mr. Carter, can you tell me a little more about your background?" Steve Carter explained that he had grown up in New Jersey, adopted from a Honolulu orphanage when he was 4 years old. His adoption papers listed him as Tenzin Amy, a name he had never understood, marked with vague information about being half-native Hawaiian. His blonde hair and blue eyes had never matched that description, but as a child, he had accepted what was written. His adoptive parents, Steve and Pat Carter, had been kind, steady people who gave him a happy childhood. Questions about his origins had always been met with the same answer. The adoption was legal, the records complete. Then, a few weeks earlier, while scrolling through news on his tablet, Steve had come across a story about a woman who discovered she was a kidnapped child after recognizing herself on a missing persons website. The story haunted him. He saw it again the next day on another network, and again the following morning on the car radio. Something about it felt directed at him. So one evening, half out of curiosity, half out of a feeling he couldn't name, he went to the same website and searched for missing children from Hawaii around the year of his birth. The image that appeared stopped him cold, the digitally aged face of a missing baby named Marks Panama Barnes, projected to what he might look like in adulthood. It was like looking into a mirror. "I can't explain it," he told the officer. "It wasn't just resemblance. It felt like I was looking at a photograph of myself, only taken years earlier than it could have been." The officer took down every detail, his fingers slowing on the keyboard as he read through the old report. The coincidences stacked neatly. Birth year 1977, Honolulu origin, an adoption around 1980 under a different name, and physical traits identical to the missing child's father. "Mr. Carter," he said finally, "I'm not making any promises, but it sounds like something we need to check. Would you be willing to submit a DNA sample?" "Yes. Anything you need." Within days, the paperwork began. The FBI's Honolulu field office coordinated with a regional unit in New Jersey to collect Carter's sample. At the same time, Honolulu detectives reached out to the last living relative listed in the file, Jennifer Barnes, the half-sister who had requested the age-progressed image a decade earlier. She agreed to participate, sending her own DNA sample for comparison. For the next several months, the process was clinical and quiet. Carter went back to his job in sales, trying not to think too hard about what he had set in motion. But small details kept surfacing in his mind. The fact that his official birth certificate had been reissued years after he was supposedly born, that his file in the adoption agency had listed unknown under biological parents, that his middle name, Tenzin, was Tibetan, something that made no sense in Hawaii. He began writing everything down, assembling his life into a timeline. The more he wrote, the stranger it looked. It wasn't just a few missing details. It was as if his first 4 years had been erased and rewritten. Months passed. Then, one morning near the end of the year, he received a call from a Honolulu number. The voice on the line belonged to the same officer who had taken his first call. "Mr. Carter," the man said, his tone steady but low. "We got the results." Steve's hands tightened around the phone. "The DNA match is conclusive. You are Marks Panama Moriarty Barnes, the missing infant from 1977. There was no sound for several seconds, only the faint hiss of the line. Carter sat down slowly, his breath unsteady. In a single sentence, the past he never knew had been handed back to him, not as memory, but as evidence. He asked what had happened to his mother, and the officer explained what the old file suggested. That Charlotte Moriarty had been found wandering with the baby shortly after their disappearance, had given false names for both of them, and was admitted briefly to a psychiatric hospital. She left a day later, leaving the baby behind under the name Tenzin Amy. The police, unable to connect the false identity to the missing persons report, placed the child under state care. Carter listened without interrupting. The system had misplaced him for 3 decades. His father had searched, his sister had waited, and somewhere along the line, the paper trail had split, one half labeled lost, the other adopted. When the call ended, he sat for a long time at his kitchen table, the same place where he'd eaten breakfast every day for years. Outside, snow was falling over the quiet streets of New Jersey. He looked at his reflection in the window and tried to decide which name belonged to the man staring back. Steve Carter, the man he had always been, or Marks Panama Barnes, the the child who had never had a chance to grow up under his own name. In Honolulu, the officer wrote the final note in the reopened case file. Status updated. Subject located, alive and identified by DNA confirmation. Case reopened for administrative resolution. After 34 years, the silence that had followed the disappearance finally broke. Not with an arrest or a confession, but with the voice of the missing child himself, calling from across the ocean to tell the world he was still here. The news reached the Barnes family quietly. There was no media announcement, no police press conference, just a private phone call to the only surviving relatives listed in the file. For Jennifer Barnes, Charlotte's daughter from an earlier relationship, the call came while she was at work. The officer's voice on the other end said, almost apologetically, "We found him." Jennifer froze. For years she had kept her half-brother's name alive, Marks Panama Moriarty Barnes, though she had never met him. She had grown up hearing fragments of the story from her father, Mark Barnes, who had spent decades waiting for a knock that never came. When she convinced the Honolulu Police Department to reopen the case in 2001, it had felt like the last thing she could do for her family's memory. Now, 10 years later, the officer's words seemed unreal. She asked for details, her voice trembling. The answer came simple and factual. "The DNA matches. He's alive. He's been living under the name Steve Carter in New Jersey." For a long moment, Jennifer couldn't speak. The tiny, grainy image she had once seen on a government website, a digital reconstruction of what her brother might look like as an adult, now had a living counterpart. Somewhere out there, that face was real. In Hawaii, when the department confirmed the identification, they reached out to Mark Barnes. The years had not been kind to him. His health had declined, his hair white, his memory slower but still sharp enough to understand what the detective was saying. When told that his son was alive, his first reaction was disbelief, then an almost painful relief that made him sit down before he could answer. "I always thought the system lost him," he said quietly. "But I never thought the system would find him again." They told him his son had been adopted legally after Charlotte's disappearance, raised by a family who had no idea he had been declared missing. There had been no crime in the traditional sense, just a chain of bureaucratic failures, one mistaken form after another, until a child's name had been replaced by another and a whole history rewritten. When the officers left, Mark sat alone for a long time. He looked around his small home, the same one he had once shared with Charlotte, and his eyes stopped on the old wooden crib, still in the corner. He had never thrown it away. A week later, Steve Carter, now officially recognized as Marks Panama Barnes, received an email from Jennifer. It was short, careful, and deeply human. "I think I'm your sister. I've been looking for you for a very long time. You don't owe me anything, but I'd love to hear your voice." He wrote back the same day. Their first conversation lasted nearly 2 hours. She told him about the island, about their father's decades of searching, and about Charlotte, their mother, who had never been found. Carter listened quietly, trying to imagine the life that might have been his. The beach he had once known as a baby, the house by the palms, the father who had waited 34 years. They began exchanging photographs. Jennifer sent pictures of their father in his younger years, standing by the same porch where Charlotte had once held Marks as an infant. Carter sent a photo of himself with his own wife and daughter. In it, he looked both familiar and foreign to Jennifer. The smile, the shape of his face, even the way his shoulders tilted. It was like seeing a reflection of their father, reborn. Arrangements were made for a reunion, but Mark's health deteriorated quickly. He passed away in 2014 before they could meet in person. Before his death, he spoke to his son once on the phone. Jennifer later described that conversation as quiet, mostly breathing. Mark said only one thing worth remembering. "You've lived a good life. That's all I ever wanted." For Steve, the discovery of his real identity didn't erase the 30 years that had come before. He often said that the Carter family, Steve and Pat, his adoptive parents, were his true parents in every way that mattered. They had raised him, loved him, and given him stability. But now, understanding his past gave those years a new texture, a deeper gravity. When reporters eventually learned of his story, they called it the self-solved cold case. Carter rarely agreed to interviews, but when he did, he spoke not about mystery or miracle, but about coincidence and persistence. "It wasn't a case solved by police," he said once. "It was solved by people who refused to stop believing someone was still out there." He flew to Hawaii a year after the identification. Standing on the same beach where his mother's stroller had once been found, he said later that it felt like walking through the outline of a dream he couldn't remember. The locals, many of them children at the time of the disappearance, came to greet him quietly. Someone handed him a faded newspaper clipping with the headline, "Mother and Infant Missing, Hau'ula, 1977. He kept that clipping folded in his wallet for months after. When he met Jennifer in person for the first time, the moment was oddly simple. No cameras, no ceremony. She hugged him as though he had just come home from a long trip, not a lifetime. "You look like Dad," she whispered. He laughed, a sound half relief and half disbelief. They spent hours talking about what could have been, about the mother they never truly knew, about the idea of two families that somehow existed on parallel tracks. When the conversation turned quiet, Jennifer said something that would stay with him. "You weren't lost. You were just waiting to be found." That night, as he sat alone in his hotel room, Steve Carter unfolded his adoption papers beside the new documents the Honolulu authorities had given him, one listing him as Tenzin Amy, another as Steve Carter, and now the reinstated original, Marks Panama Moriarty Barnes. 10 names, 3 birth certificates, 2 days of birth, and a single life bridging them all. He realized he would never fully be one or the other. The past and present were now fused, the boy from Oahu and the man from New Jersey sharing the same heartbeat. In a statement he later gave for a missing persons awareness program, he said, "Finding out who you are doesn't mean losing who you've been. I'm grateful for both lives, the one that was taken and the one I was given." In the file room of the Honolulu Police Department, case number 1977 HNL 302 was finally stamped closed. After 34 years, the story that had begun with a mother's walk to the store ended not with an arrest or a confession, but with a voice on the phone saying, "I think I might be someone you've been looking for." The ocean outside Hau'ula remained unchanged. Same sand, same rhythm, same promise that the sea always gives back what it takes, though sometimes it takes a lifetime to do so. When the official documents arrived, they came in a plain envelope. No ceremony, no seal to mark what it carried. Inside was a short letter from the Honolulu Police Department confirming what months of testing had already proved. Steve Carter and Marks Panama Moriarty Barnes were the same person. Attached were photocopies of the DNA results, a reinstated birth certificate from 1977, and the note "Case closed for identification." For the first time in more than 3 decades, the file that had once begun with the words "Mother and Infant Missing" now ended with "Subject located," alive. Yet for those who had lived inside the silence of that file, closure was not a single moment. It was a slow rearranging of everything they thought they knew. Steve sat with his adoptive parents, Pat and Steve Carter Sr., at the kitchen table in New Jersey, reading the letter aloud. Pat's hands shook as she listened. They had adopted him legally in 1980, never doubting that the documents provided by the Honolulu orphanage were genuine. "We had no reason to question it," she said quietly. "We thought we were giving a home to a child who needed one." She looked at him the way she had since he was small, like her own son. "None of this changes that," she added, and meant it. For Steve, hearing those words mattered more than the revelation itself. He had found the truth of his beginnings, but his loyalty and gratitude belonged to the life that had raised him. In interviews years later, he would describe it simply: "I was born Marks, but I became Steve. Both are true." Still, knowing what had happened filled the missing years with both clarity and sorrow. Through the police report, he learned details of how he had been lost. That Charlotte Moriarty, his biological mother, had been found only a day after she disappeared, wandering near a stranger's house with him in her arms. She had given false names for both of them, Jane and Tenzin Amy, and was placed briefly under psychiatric observation. The doctors had noted signs of mental confusion, possible postpartum illness. The next morning, she vanished again, leaving the baby behind. The child, listed under the false name, was transferred to state care. Because the mother's real identity was never verified, and the missing person report had been filed under the name Barnes, no one connected the two cases. Within months, the infant became legally free for adoption. That bureaucratic gap, no larger than a misplaced form, had separated an entire family for 34 years. When Steve read those words, he realized the truth was neither dramatic nor criminal. There was no kidnapper, no conspiracy. It was, in its way, a quieter tragedy, a combination of illness, misunderstanding, and clerical failure. A mistake, he would later say, that lasted a lifetime. The following year, he returned to Hawaii with his wife, Tracy, and their young daughter. The trip was both symbolic and necessary, a way to see the place where his story had begun. At the airport, he was met by Jennifer Barnes, who had flown in from California. It was the second time they met in person, but the first time they stood together on Hawaiian soil. They drove to Hau'ula. The old road was still there, narrower but recognizable, winding, between the palms and the shoreline. The house where Charlotte and Mark had lived no longer stood. A new family occupied the land. But the sea looked the same. Jennifer pointed to the stretch of sand where the stroller had once been found. "They said it was right there," she whispered. Steve didn't answer. He just looked at the horizon, the same blue-gray his mother must have seen that morning in 1977. In that moment, he felt less like a man revisiting the past, and more like someone standing between two versions of himself: the baby who had vanished and the adult who had returned. The sea breeze was soft, and for a brief second, he thought he could almost hear an echo, like a lullaby carried on the wind. Later, they visited the police archives in Honolulu. The detectives who handled his identification let him hold the original case folder. It was thinner than he expected, barely a dozen pages, and smelled of old paper and salt air. Inside was a black and white photograph of his father, Mark Barnes, taken in the late 1970s. He was younger than Steve was now. His expression was calm but tired, as if holding back everything he could not say. Next to the photograph was the final notation from 2011. Case resolved. Subject identified alive. No criminal action. Administrative error connected to psychiatric misidentification, 1977. It was a single paragraph that contained a family's entire history of loss and recovery. In the years that followed, Steve Carter became an unexpected advocate for missing persons cases. He began speaking publicly about the importance of keeping records updated, of checking national databases even for decades-old cases. He often said he wasn't special, only lucky enough to live in an age where technology could find what paper lost. The story spread internationally. Reporters from the BBC, CNN, and CBS came to interview him. Headlines called it, "The Boy Who Solved His Own Case." But behind the attention, Steve kept his life grounded. He still worked his regular job, still took his daughter to school, still spent Sundays fixing things around the house. When people asked what it felt like to solve a mystery about himself, he said, "It feels like remembering a dream someone else had for me." One interviewer asked whether he felt anger toward the system that had failed him. He paused before answering. "Anger doesn't bring anyone back," he said. "Understanding does. My father never stopped searching. My sister never stopped asking. And my adoptive parents never stopped loving me. I got to have all of them in one lifetime. That's more than most people ever get." Back in Hawaii, the porch light outside Mark Barnes's old house still burned every night. The new owners had left it that way after hearing the story. "It seemed right to keep it on," one of them said. When Steve learned that, he smiled softly. "Then maybe he finally found his way home," he said. For the official record, the case of Mark's Panama Moriarty, Barnes was now closed. But for those who lived it, it would never really end. It had become something else entirely, a story not about disappearance, but about return, not about loss, but about the fragile persistence of love across time, names, and chance. The ocean beside Hau'ula kept its rhythm, unchanging as ever. Locals still said it returned whatever it took. Some evenings, when the tide rolled in and the light turned gold, a few of them swore they could feel a quiet kind of peace in the air, the sort that comes only after a long search finally finds its way home. Years passed, but the story of Mark's Panama Moriarty Barnes, now known to most as Steve Carter, never truly left the public imagination. It had become one of those rare cases where tragedy, accident, and redemption intertwined until they were indistinguishable. What began as a disappearance in a small Hawaiian town ended as a lesson in how memory, persistence, and technology could resurrect even the quietest of cases. In 2013, Carter was invited to speak at a national conference for missing persons and child welfare advocates. He stood on the small stage, wearing a dark jacket that contrasted with the easy calm of his voice. He didn't speak like someone retelling a miracle. He spoke like a man sorting facts, careful and steady, grounding the extraordinary in the ordinary. "I didn't solve my case," he said. "The people who refused to forget did. My sister kept asking questions. The police kept the file open. Someone, somewhere, decided to upload an old photograph to a database. That's how I was found. Every missing person deserves at least that, a chance to be remembered." The audience, composed of investigators, social workers, and families of the missing, listened in silence. Many of them had their own empty chairs at home, their own porch lights left burning. Steve's story didn't erase their grief, but it gave them something equally valuable. Proof that sometimes, even decades later, the story can bend toward hope. Outside the conference, he was stopped by a woman clutching a photo of her son who had vanished in 1985. She asked if he believed her boy might still be alive. Steve paused, then answered in the same quiet tone he used when speaking to reporters. "If my life teaches anything, it's that the answer might be yes. Don't close the door until you have to." He carried that message with him everywhere. Over the next decade, he became involved in several awareness programs that focused on improving identification systems for long-term missing children. He worked with data scientists to refine age progression imaging, the very technology that had brought his face back into the world. When the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children launched a campaign using his story, he allowed them to use his image, not for recognition, but as a symbol of endurance. Despite the attention, his life in New Jersey remained quiet. He returned to his job, spent weekends with his family, and preferred long walks over interviews. The only sign of his unusual history was a framed photograph on his living room wall. 2 birth certificates side by side. On the left, the name Tenzin Amy, the false identity given to him by mistake. On the right, Mark's Panama Moriarty Barnes, his restored name. Beneath them, a note written in his own hand. Both are me. One lived the mystery, the other solved it. In 2019, he returned once more to Oahu. Jennifer met him at the airport, her hair streaked with gray, her smile still carrying the same warmth as the first day they met. They drove north to Hauula, where the air smelled of salt and rain, and the sea stretched endless and calm. The house that had belonged to their father had been rebuilt entirely, but the land felt unchanged. The new owner, a middle-aged man, greeted them politely and showed them a small wooden sign hanging by the porch. Welcome home. He explained that the sign had been there since before he bought the property, and that he never removed it. The old man who lived here before told me to leave it, he said. Said it was for someone still out there. Steve stood there for a long time, running his hand along the wood. The paint had faded, but the letters were still visible. Welcome home. It was the last message his father had ever left him, waiting all those years without knowing it would one day be answered. That evening, Steve and Jennifer sat by the beach as the sun dropped behind the ridge. They talked about their father, about Charlotte, and about how a single error had shaped their lives. They also talked about what it meant to move forward, not to forget, but to carry. Jennifer said softly, "Sometimes I think Mom wasn't running away. Maybe she was just lost inside her own mind, and the world didn't know how to find her." Steve nodded. "Maybe the world's better at finding people now," he said, "but it still has to care enough to look." The wind shifted, carrying the smell of the ocean. For a while, neither of them spoke. When the story of the Barnes disappearance was later revisited in a documentary, it was told not as a tale of crime, but of rediscovery. Investigators used the case to demonstrate how mental illness, administrative error, and a lack of communication between agencies could fracture lives, and how data, science, and human persistence could mend them again. In 2023, when news reached him that his father, Mark Barnes, had passed away, Steve returned again to Hawaii to attend a small memorial service. Jennifer had organized it by the sea, scattering their father's ashes into the water. Standing there, Steve said a simple prayer. Not for justice, not for closure, but for peace. He whispered, "You kept the light on, Dad. I found my way back." The ocean was calm that day. The waves reached the shore and pulled back, as if answering an old promise. If this story moved you, and you believe that every missing voice deserves to be heard, subscribe to our channel for more real cases where time, faith, and persistence uncovered the truth. Tell us in the comments, do you believe the past can always find its way back?